In the name of the one and only, we are in the Indigo Firmament and would like to continue our discussion of the God phenomenon, which we started in the previous session. In this session, I wanted to explore a few other concepts that are more culturally related or culturally understood, but still so to say, celestially related, connecting the human thought and the human perception with celestial bodies. In the previous session, we discussed how the days of the week or the month were named after gods, and how gods were given a personality that included, how celestial bodies were creating personalities that included an element of divinity, and that the sun god or the moon god and so on were both, they had a celestial reality as well as a dimension of divinity in them, and that they talked to humans, they channeled energies through humans, and then they communicated with humans. And in a way that we humans looked at our own selves in the context of the binary gender reality, male and female, and how that resulted in the production or procreation of life as a male and female. We, in a sense, also attributed this to the celestial bodies, that the sun was often associated with the male, with the male energies, the dominating male energies, and giving life in its own sense. But then the moon was created and associated with the female. We can see certain signs which are sometimes difficult to explain, whether these are evolutionary or that they are mere matters of coincidence. Take, for instance, the lunar cycle with the menstrual cycle of a woman. That is one and the same. Coincidental? Perhaps. But if it is mere coincidental, then why have we always associated the beauty of a woman with that of the moon? Moon comes in the dark of night. So does a woman. So does the feminine. If we look at the ancient myths, one of which we still have, Adam and Eve, for example. Adam's first partner was not Eve, but was Lilith. And Lilith comes from the word Layl, and Layl means night. In Arabic too. The most common theme for songs in Arabic is Layli ya Layli, and if you Google it or search on YouTube, you could find hundreds of songs that start with the word Layl. And Layl and Wail go together. The Wail is the craving, the calling, the yearning, the desire to be with, and the Layl is the night. And if we follow our previous session's discussion on the sense of isolation and the need to reconnect with our environment, to have that sense of security, then the search in the night, when the darkness of the night covers everything from us, it veils everything, we have this urge and this need of reconnecting back. And yes, you could claim that this is a male perspective, but it could be cross-gender. It could be both the men seeking women and the women seeking men, and we have to understand that for our mature audience, that I'm sure the audience of this program are, the procreation ritual has its own divinity in them, because in both there's creation and procreation. In essence, we become gods on earth to create and reproduce. And so if there is that desire that men seek women and women seek men at night in the dark, what does that symbolize? Remember, in the myth of Adam, God created a woman, I think this is Quranic too, so that Adam will not be alone. Adam will not feel isolated. Adam will not feel distanced. And so Adam, the androgynous being, needed a pair. And whether Adam is male or female, my argument would be that Adam is both. And so it's pair, zawj in Arabic. And therefore, in the pair, in that paired relationship, they got a sense of security, they got a sense of belonging. They saw themselves as other than the one that they had accompanied, and vice versa. So there was a relational connection, and there was a sense of security. There was a sense of belonging, and there was a sense of distancing themselves from the isolation that would have bothered them, obviously. So when Adam is paired in the Garden of Eden, it's for its sense of comfort and security. And yes, through human experience, we do that often. And my argument here is that why the darkness of the night? Because that darkness, in essence, is where birthing takes place. Take the lunar calendar, for example. The date changes in the lunar calendar when the night falls, after the sunset. So first comes the whole night, and then comes the whole day. That's how lunar calendars work, because of the advent of the darkness of the night. The darkness gives birth. It is not only the dark of the night that then gives birth to the light that comes after, but there is also the darkness of the womb. Yes, the dark eyes, the dark tresses. We associate a lot of these darknesses with dark in color, with the feminine energy. Now, this is not the dark as the negative, but the symbolism in the colors. That we have a lot of poetry, perhaps not so much in the blonde and blue-eyed European cultural setting, but in most other cultures, the darkness of the eyes and the hair and all that is admired. It's idealized, it's romanticized. And with it comes also the term Layl, which is the night, but Layl, as I said, is also the first partner the first pair of Adam, before there was Eve. And then, as there are all these coincidences, and I believe that they're probably not coincidences, but when we lack any explanation, we take resort in that. But what about the word Eve? Adam and Eve. And Eve, like evening, New Year's Eve, implies again that dark side that works on that compatibility between light and dark. So then we have also, in the more romantic sense, not only is Layli or Layla or variations of it among the most common names, but even our goddess of love, if I can take the liberty of using that term, and I don't mean it in the divine sense. Remember Layli and Majnun. The story there, the myth there, has a very heavy symbolism in it. Is that Layli is the darkness, the feminine energy that draws Majnun to it, Qais. And Qais is drawn by this beauty to a point where he is mesmerized, his masculine energies are mesmerized, and he goes insane and crazy in love. And that's what the word Majnun means. And Majnun comes from the word Junun. Junun is jinn, and jinn is an energy. Again, we personify the word quite a lot, as though jinns are living beings in some way. Yes, you could say they are living beings, but they are living beings in the forms of energies. And sometimes when these energies impregnate you, when these energies take over you, when these energies dominate you, you lose the self, and you become one, as we could say the English term, obsessed by, or taken by, or overtaken. So when we are overtaken by that energy, which in the context of Layli and Majnun is, of course, this uncontrollable energy of love and desire and yearning, then you become a Majnun. Not insane in the negative sense of it, but one would wear that as a badge of honor, to be crazily in love, because that power is so strong. Remember, in an earlier session we did talk about human beings or creation having come into existence not because God as the absolute totality and singularity needed a multiplicity, but because it loved the multiplicity, because it loved to create, and so it created the multiplicity. And so therefore the raison d'être, the very reason for our existence in the realm of multiplicities, is love. God loved to be known, and so God created. And so if that love, that yearning, that urge, that desire was that strong that it turned the absolute oneness of God into the multiplicity of existence. For those who are more familiar with the Arabic term, when wahdat became kasrat, when the absolute oneness of God turned into a multiplicity of existence, that other realities manifested out of that one God. The thrust and the force behind all of that was love. And love in relation to reason can be easily understood that reason is the rational power, but when the emotional side takes over, the rational side is edged out. And so insanity in that sense is a positive thing. When you fall in love crazily, if we can use the word, to be crazily in love is a positive thing. And so in the context of Layli and Majnun, then Qais, who became Majnun, who became crazy in love, made him, in that sense, in the cultural sense, a god of love in the minds of people, of course, in the cultural context, not in the religious context. So I hope I don't offend people's feelings there. And therefore, Layli is again birthing that concept of love. And this Layli would be same as that Layli we talked about before, the wife of Adam in an earlier version of the myth of Adam and Eve. And of course that connects with Eve, but we also can take that way far back to the myth of the Egyptians. And in the Egyptian myth too, that which give life to everything, that in the beginning there was darkness, which will be again Layl, the night. In the beginning there was darkness. And then when we go to the biblical text, again when it says, and then there was light, so light came after. But before there was light, there had to have been darkness, because otherwise it would not make sense to say, and then there was light. Obviously, so there was darkness before. In other words, darkness has a primacy in there, of being first, being there, just like I explained in the context of the calendars that we have, that even in the solar calendar, the date changes in the heart of the night. Remember the AM, PM, antemeridium and postmeridium switches happen in the dark of night, and in the lunar calendars they come with the advent of night. Again, darkness always comes, has always existed before there was any light. And it is back then in that context that we were talking about, the dark womb in which life is created. And that too, if you go to Hinduism, and the rituals of procreation are seen as the level of worship, the worship of gods and goddesses. And so therefore for some people this might make them comfortable, the analogies that I'm drawing here. But in the course of human history and the evolutionary history of the God-centered thought, there is nothing new in that. And so if then we come to our modern times, that how do we perceive gods now? That with the rise of Christian theocracies in Europe, the divide between reason and revelation that was so great that if it weren't for Muslims, both in Southwest Asia as well as in North Africa and in the Iberian Peninsula, who first saved, protected, and then expanded on the Greek thought, and then wedded reason, the Greek reasoning of God, with a Quranic revelation. And that compatibility became the norm, which surprised Europeans. But by the time that idea reached Spain, Europe was in a way ready to launch on this. Not at the grassroots level, not at the popular level, but at the highest level of religious thoughts, such as Thomas Aquinas, for instance, or Musa ibn Maimun or Maimonides, one Christian, one Jew, along with Ibn Rushd or Averroes. So these three thinkers, when the world was divided into the dark ages of Europe and the enlightened ages of the Muslim world, these three thinkers tried to bridge that gap between reason and revelation and find the compatibility between the two. And the end result was that because religion had monopolized the understanding and interpretation of God, whether God was understood in its strict monotheistic terms or in the Trinitarian concepts of Hellenic Christianity, in either case, the concept of God became their monopoly. And so when there was the first Reformation, the Reformation was in essence a rejection of that thought. And the unfortunate part of it was that they rejected God along with it, if not in the Reformation period, certainly in the Age of Enlightenment. And so Western thought became a secular thought, and secular thought had no place for God, and so God became irrelevant. And therefore, reason and revelation became the opposites one more time. This time, reason sitting at the helm, just as religion or revelation was before. So the European thinking was basically an either-or approach to the understanding of God, that if religious theocracy had the chance and the power and the monopoly, then reason was marginalized. And when rationalism took over, then religion was basically marginalized, disenfranchised, and pushed to the periphery. The other cultural experiences were different, of course, but it's unfortunate that many in the Muslim world, as well as in other cultures of Asia and Africa, are following the European approach to the reason and revelation argument, that just because the Europeans had the bad experience of not having the compatibility or not understanding a compatibility between reason and revelation, and therefore for the European the only way to progress was to reject revelation, to reject religion, to reject God, to become secular. This is reason for European advancement. But other societies had different experience. In the Muslim world, for instance, because reason and revelation were seen compatible, therefore you did not have to reject one to accept the other, but that you could accept both. So while the European approach was either or, the approach in the Muslim world was both and, that they could accept both. And so therefore Muslims need not reject religion to become progressive on the European model, because Muslims did not have theocracy. They did not have the monopoly of revelation to marginalize reason. In other words, the progress in the Muslim world progressed because of accepting both reason and revelation. And Europe progressed when they rejected rituals and revelation and resorted to reason. So again, this is kind of a blind following of a Western pattern of thought and a Western pattern towards progress. But Muslims being in the kind of in their own dark ages in our times, I guess, it's kind of difficult to expect of them at this point to be thinking creatively and more rationally and reasonably. So then we come to the concept of what is the again, in following up that argument about the God phenomenon. So what is a modernistic approach or new modernism of what God is? And again, we are centering this primarily in Western thinking. The general perception is that because God was essential and necessary for a sense of connectedness and security, because again, as it's believed that in earlier times every natural phenomenon that God was seen in every natural phenomenon, and therefore if there was natural disaster, for instance, fire, a storm, a flood, it was seen as though the hand of God was in it. In other words, the wrath of nature was considered the wrath of God. And therefore there was a kind of personification of nature gods. And so the role that humankind played was that so long as we humans were at the mercy of nature, then we had to accept not only nature but the God nature too. That we had to accept floods and furies and fires and hurricanes and tornadoes and all that as either gods or the work of God. And obviously then, because of their nature, their disaster nature, then these were seen as the anger and the wrath of God. And as we move on into modern times, and again from a strictly European perspective, that the evolution and progress of humanity from a Western culture point of view is measured by how much can humankind conquer nature. This conquering of nature, this developing nature, trampling on the environment and all that. Other cultures may see it differently, but the West see it as progress. And in this progress, the more humankind becomes independent, the more humankind conquers nature, along with it, it conquers God too. Because remember, God was equated to nature. The wrath of nature was the wrath of God. And so if you can harness nature, natural disasters, then you have virtually eliminated the need for any God. So people didn't have to pray to God and plead for help and raise their hands and ask for help from God. They could dial 911, they could call the Salvation Army, they could call the different government agencies that deal with the disasters such as FEMA and this and that. And so therefore, in times of such natural disasters, you dial a number from a phone booth or from your cell phone, from your smartphone, instead of going to the church or a place of worship. And so if the governor or the president can help alleviate the damage, and in cases perhaps prevent the occurrence of a damage by building dams and controlling things, water flows through water canals and so on and so forth, then in a way gods have been made irrelevant in human life. And so that modern perception, then, the God as the need, or the environmental God as a need for humans don't exist. In other words, we have our environmental disasters that too are devoid of any divinity. Just like in an earlier period, the celestial bodies were devoid of God's existence, of any divinity in them. Now the environment too. And then remember, we went through a set of arguments that, as I said in the earlier session, that when we are born, we keep expanding and exploring our environment to relate to it. And in each one we seek God. In our parents, in our family environment, social environment, terrestrial natural environment, celestial environment, and beyond. So we keep going out that way, looking for gods. And then in the secularization of this thought, the reverse pattern is followed. That because our sciences are not capable of admitting to the fact that there is no way that they can understand the entirety of cosmos. There's no way they can measure the cosmic reality. They have no capacity. Okay, they only have to accept it in theory. They cannot prove anything. Therefore, the one thing they can definitely do, the scientific thinking, is to deny God in that. And once God is denied in the celestial, then we beyond celestial, then we come to the celestial, in which God is denied having had any role or any field of energy in the sun and the moon and so on. And then we come to the environment here down on earth, where natural disasters and floods and fires are controlled by human activity through our industrialization and the equipments we have created. So then there's no God in the environment. Then we come to our social behavior, where our social thinking, which had a God element in that, by establishing certain norms and moral codes and so on, including, of course, those that had started with certain religious belief systems. So there, the God element is excluded. And that then brings us back to even the individual and personal level, where, say, in terms of lifestyle, that certain behaviors in terms of our lifestyles that were attributed to gods, and then since gods are denied there, then we take liberties with these too. And so therefore, in a strictly modern term, there is no God and there is no room for God. Whether that God is the celestial, environmental, social, familial, in any way. So we have become, in that sense, a very secular, if we define secular as not necessarily ungodly, because that too is a religious term, but in an environment where the God phenomenon has become either irrelevant or strictly marginalized to a point where we, out of another necessity, have become so totally self-centered. And it's in this self-centeredness that we have evolved socially and economically in a different way. Our economic system, capitalism, for instance, the difference between socialism and capitalism in respect to the discussion we have is that in socialism, the priorities of the society, the needs of the society, are prioritized over the needs of the individual. That which is good for the society ought to be also good for an individual member of that society. Whereas in capitalism, it's the other way around. It's the need and priorities of an individual that trumps everything that is social oriented. And perhaps that's the reason that socialism was seen as the enemy. And of course there was this other connection made, again going back to the Cold War years, that socialism, Soviet socialism, was also an evil empire, and the evil, of course, had the religious connotations, so they were godless. And of course from the communist socialist angle, the same thing was pursued, that they also denied capitalism because it denied the human nature, the human need, the collective human need in that sense. And so the whole struggle between capitalism and communism, or communism/socialism, for the 70-year period that divided these two, were strictly based on that concept of God centered with or without the God. But to bring it back to our age of modernity, then one would assume, if this is the case, that God is not relevant in anything we do as modern people, then why the obsession persists and continues? That is because, in my opinion, of course, is that we have not made a distinction between the sense of security of the body, the form of us as living beings, which is separate. Remember, the argument we had earlier was that as we evolve, we needed to have a sense of belonging to our environment. And so we had to relate to everything, and we had to feel connected to everything. And so therefore, we had to create gods in them to have a point of reference, to have a sense of belonging, a sense of security and connection. But that was the environmental. And as we just presented the argument, that as we in essence conquered the environment or made attempts to conquer the environment, that God created out of that necessity became irrelevant. What we have not dealt with is that our sense of security or lack of it and the insecurities we feel may not necessarily be merely a matter of our physical environment or our physical needs or our physical survival. We need another sense of security. That would be the sense of psycho-spiritual security. And I'm using the term psycho-spiritual to cover all the bases. Is that human beings by nature are spiritual beings, and spiritual not necessarily in the religious sense, but in the sense that there is a need and an understanding of us being more than just the physical beings that we are. And so that spiritual part of us, that spiritual dimension of us, which has the psychological dimension as well, therefore the psycho-spiritual part of us feels that sense of insecurity and needs to solve that. So since in that part God has not become irrelevant, because that has nothing to do with how safe and secure we feel in our physical environment. Therefore, the evolutionary side of this, at least again in the Western world, is that people are seeking God, but a different God than the one that has been prescribed by scriptures. And therefore, we have a new age religion developing in the West. And this new age religion is trying to understand God as a phenomenon beyond the monopoly of any religious institution. And therefore, they abhor organized religion, and yet they still seek God for their psycho-spiritual needs. And it's in this new age where, at least here in the West, in the United States, people explore Sufism, people explore Buddhism, people explore other isms other than the establishmentarian notion of what religion ought to be and what God ought to be, because they are not they are not bought into the argument of a monopolistic argument that the God of this or that religion is the only way to be understood and worshipped. And so, while the level of religiosity is on the decline, the level of spirituality is on the rise. And this distinction is also very critical, that from the human experience we know that often religion divides and spirituality unites. Religion has the vulnerability of being dragged into what I call religious tribalism. And it's this religious tribalism which has a heavy element of political religiosity, or the politics of religion. And that by its own nature is a divisive factor. add to that the element of monopolistic attitude, especially in the monotheistic religions, because if there is one God, then that one God ought to be the one that I believe in, as opposed to the one that someone else does. Polytheistic traditions have done much better on these accounts, and they have been much less violent by comparison. But monotheistic traditions have had these not only monotheism but the monopoly on monotheism, and not only the fact that there is one God, but the fact that the one God is the God that I believe in, and therefore in the conflict of cross-religious conflicts, it has devastated many societies. And I don't mean to discount the destructive role of ideologies and other isms not godly related, but monotheistic traditions have done their share as well. And so it is the avoidance of this monopolistic thinking of monotheistic traditions in the context of organized religion that is rejected by a modernity that is still hungering and thirsting and yearning for some understanding of the divine. That divine need not be named. For that divine, they want to come together. And it's like the spokes of a wheel that at the periphery, near the circumference, they are far and apart. But when they converge and come to the center, they all blend in. And in this New Age religious thinking, the God that they want to understand doesn't have a name, doesn't have a label or a license plate, doesn't have a cultural identity. It's a universal God, a better understanding beyond the ideologized religions that most of the rest of the world suffer from. And so for them, that need to connect, that need to bridge the gap between the divine and the profane, between God and human, is felt very strongly. And they may or may not go to a place of worship like others, but they can go to a place of meditation. They don't have to wear their religiosity on their sleeves and to export it to others and to explore it and to expose it to others, to show off that they are godly. So they don't go out there to show to others. Instead, they go within themselves. They go to their hearts. They explore within the inner God. And that is no one else's business. And therefore, it doesn't come to conflict with views of others. And so this search for the divine within is perhaps, in my estimation, based on what we discussed so far, to be our newer version of understanding how God is to be perceived in modern times. I'm thinking of sharing with you a chapter that is more a reflection on the opening of the Quran, that I have visualized, in the sense that if we can think that if Quran had been revealed to humanity in our time and in our age, how would it sound? And that sound, like I said, it amounts to basically a reading of the Fatiha, the opening chapter of the Quran, but in a more modern language with modern terminologies, that could encompass a more universal thinking on in where we live. And with that, we will conclude this session. The poem is Hearing Him Hum, and that's also on my website, stanizai.org, for those of you who want to check it out. In the name of the paracosmic consciousness, whose oneness of being pins the verses of perpetually unfolding multiplicities, whose essence weaves into every fiber of our existence as the wholeness of immeasurable, timeless tomorrows. All praise is due to the infinite eternity, whose love radiates through our soul, whose glory graces every grain of our being, and whose awe paints our fragile illusions. O divine beloved, the ineffable shaper of transient temporalities and transcendent realities, give us the thought that thinks thee. Give us a pleading heart that desires thee, a yearning that utters nothing but your love. Turn us into a longing that dies to dissolve in the harmonic convergence of your totality. Help us thread our pathways through the splendor of your enchanting gardens and idyllic meadows, where moments of your manifest beauty attain a foreverness all their own. Distance us from the dissonance of dark energy. Bathe us in the luminous glow of your countenance, light upon light upon light. Have a good day.